Nearly my entire talk is going to be drilling down on Isabel's get the right business case. So I'm going to talk about how we at HighWire have tried to do that. I'm going to make 2 points first, though. I'm going to focus almost entirely on editorial challenges and opportunities. That is, the types of things that are the challenges and opportunities that journal editors have. There are lots of other possible uses of AI, for example, in the researcher workflow. I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to focus on the editorial opportunities because that's where we've run through a process and gathered some data. So in a way, I have some evidence, the data side, to bring to it. And the second prefatory comment is that I'm not going to be very strict about AI versus big data versus decision support. What we found in running through our process with editors is that they really just have problems that they want solved or opportunities that they want to capture. They know that it's woo-woo somewhere out in the future, but they really don't know much about AI. They might even be using it in their labs, but it's usually the grad students and the postdocs who are doing that. So I'm not going to be terribly strict about AI. Uh-oh. It looks like the builds aren't going to work. All right. So imagine that pink box doesn't exist right now. So about 2 years ago, AI zoomed onto the agenda of the scholarly publishers that HighWire works with this press release from Meta. And what it basically, a lot of people read it and inferred that Meta was suggesting that editors really could be replaced by machines because, after all, the machines outperformed the editors in selecting the very best papers. So you can imagine how editors felt about this. And what that did for us at HighWire was make us wonder, what are the actual use cases that editors would be interested in rather than being replaced? And so what we worked on was first framing the right questions. Rather than starting with the technology, essentially, I've got a hammer, I've got to go find a nail to hit with it, which is, I think, some of what AI practitioners, especially in universities, are doing. We really started to think about, well, where did editors, could they get help? Where did they need to get help? And then finally, ultimately, where did they want to get help from AI? One of the regular displays of hubris among people in tech, and my colleagues in the room who've worked with me for 20 plus years can say I'm guilty of this too, that's okay, is the assumption that we understand a workflow based on looking at the resulting product. So, for example, we technology folks understand what editors do by looking at the article that comes out at the end of the workflow. And all we have to do is make it look like that, and we've done our job. Well, a bit of a personal anecdote. Years before starting HighWire, I was responsible for computer services at Stanford. And one of the computer science professors castigated me and my organization because of our plodding progress in replacing a payroll system. It was taking us over a year to do. And his way of challenging me was basically to say that he could have one of his grad students in CS write that system over the weekend. Quote, "How hard can it be to write a check?" As if what a payroll system did was essentially write checks. And what we found in working with some AI suppliers was they would look at a paper that is an article coming out of a journal and say, how hard can that be to create that, to construct that? And I think that was totally the wrong thing to do. So I should, one of the curiosities about this anecdote I just told you is that the professor who said this to me It was ironic because the computer science professor was a fellow named John McCarthy, who's widely known and credited as the father of artificial intelligence. And given the way he felt about me, he would probably be turning over in his grave seeing me give a talk on AI right now. So what we focused on was essentially to understand how to lead a journal. We had to go talk to editors themselves about doing that. What we did was put together a workshop, and I'll go into the format just a little, where we had these publishers and editors come together. The rule for this workshop was that you essentially had to bring your editor with you in order to attend. And the editor was usually the editor-in-chief of one of your journals or one of the associate editors who had a particular interest in this topic. And we put together this workshop. And you can see, if you can read this, that this is quite a variety of publishers up here. Commercial and society publishers, publishers who have one or two journals, publishers who have 15, publishers who have 50. So we had a good variety of voices in the room. And what we talked with them about was these 4 topics. This is the way we divided up the day. And we wanted to make sure that we went beyond topic number 3, which is where we were seeing a lot of people focus on, is essentially how do you handle papers. We really wanted to get into setting strategy and identifying the right people to be soliciting papers from. And then finally at the number 4, how do you interpret your results? If you make a change, how do you know that you've improved things? The format of this workshop was unlike anything we had done at HighWire for probably 15 years. We limited it to 40 people. Everyone was in the same room around a single table. Everyone could see each other. And we had the 15 publishers and editors sit together so that we would go around the table every time we had a topic we wanted to discuss. In other words, we wouldn't allow a few talkative people like me to dominate the whole conversation. We essentially required that everybody say something. And this worked pretty well. What it did was allow us to find out where there was consistency in the responses, because sometimes a person would just say, yeah, what she said. And that was okay. We didn't need to have you restate it, but it allowed us to say, yes, ASM agrees with Cell Press on this. That was pretty helpful. So this is probably the best short version of what came out of the meeting. One of the editors said to us, with lots of people nodding, is what you can get AI to do for us is make long meetings shorter. And what did this mean? This meant bring evidence to the table so that we're not having faith-based discussions, anecdata as it's jokingly called now, so that we're actually having evidence-based discussions among editors who are trying to make a policy change. And a lot of what comes up after this is in this area. So these are the 4 areas that came out. These do not align, by the way, with the 4 questions. There's some alignment. Excuse me. Can you hand me my glass of water? I hope not. Yeah. Oh, it got quiet next door.
Everybody's still alive.
Okay. What's interesting, Isabel had, what was it, predict, promote, provide, produce. I think I can structure these into predict, promote, predict, and provide. So it's just an interesting thought to do this. I'm going to drill into each one of these now. Probably worth a little bit of commentary is there is work going on in 3 of these 4 in AI now. And some of it's pretty good work, some of it's more advanced than others. At least as far as I could see, the one that is not covered is this thing that we've labeled community engagement. All the others, though, have work going on. The other thing that is maybe a little bit hard is that some areas are more advanced than others, and some areas produce more strategic value than others. For example, workflow, productivity, and efficiency. I think that's actually getting pretty advanced, and I'll show some examples of that. But it's not a place where there's a lot of strategic value. However, emergence, that is identifying newly emerging areas, there I'd say the work is just beginning, but it has huge strategic value for scoping journals, positioning editorial groups, and so on. So let me dive into each one of them. So what does journal performance mean? This is, of course, understanding how journals were performing, but it's relative to the marketplace as a whole. In other words, it's not looking at the journal's performance relative to its previous year. It's not predicting its next year. It's really looking at it in a marketplace as a whole. And you might say, well, isn't that what the JCR does? It says you're ranked number 2 in the field of neuropsychopharmacology or something like that. What came out of the discussion around this is that a lot of it has to do with the qualities of the data. The JCR is not sufficient for what people are trying to get at here. And that's because the change that they were interested in evaluating is often targeted well below the journal level to certain types of articles, to certain topics of articles within their field. And second, that if they make a change, if an editor makes a change, they want to see the impact of that change almost in real time. That is, they publish a set of articles, and 2 months later, they want to know, did that work? They don't want to wait for the next impact factors, or actually the impact factors 2 or 3 years out. So what I'd say is the journal impact factor it's a score, but it's not a tool. And what folks were looking for were tools that would work in this area. And there are some examples of these. This is the one that we've worked with Meta to deploy among a set of about 15 of HighWire's publishers. Meta's rolled it out to others as well. So this is what they call a publisher dashboard. It's looking at journal performance close to real time. It's looking, so you're not getting a year-long lag in this. And it is essentially looking at 3 months worth of articles, a moving window of 3 months worth of articles, and identifying which articles are likely to be high impact, are predicted to be higher impact than other articles, and therefore whether the impact of your collection as a whole is trending up or trending down. It does some other things as well. What I just showed you there, that's snapshots from version 1. They're working on rolling out version 2 now. So the second topic was community engagement. And honestly, it was a challenge to find the right words to describe this. But what we're really talking about here is delivering what the editors wanted were tools that would help them identify, attract, and retain the best authors and the best papers, and to essentially recruit those ahead of submission. So not identifying the best papers after they had already been submitted, but figuring out who to talk to at a meeting to encourage the submissions. So this is author prospecting, and in studying this, we talked with 10 different journal editors about how they did this, and we found that there was essentially nothing in common, which made it damned hard to think about how you'd build tools in this area. And perhaps that's why I identify this area as relatively lagging in having AI tools to help with this. What it's about is, as we talked to the editors, what they wanted was something that would help them to know who to be talking to. Because a lot of editors, at least the ones we work with, are themselves not cold call folks. In other words, they don't want to go up to somebody they don't know at a conference and shake their hand and ask them to submit a paper. You have to help them do that. And so my feeling is that the best tool in this is essentially going to help people get over it being a conversation like cold call. Switch that from if you will, a recruitment conversation, which is a personal sort of thing, to being a scientific conversation. In other words, give me, if I'm a recruiting editor, give me information about the person you want me to talk to so that I can have a scientific conversation with them, not a personal conversation. I can talk about their research, their recent publications, the work that their lab has funded and underway now, posters they've recently submitted. I also know whether I've rejected any of their papers recently, and so on. What I would have called in the pre-Trump era a dossier to help people over the social awkwardness of recruiting. And as I said, I don't think there's anything really underway here, but I think it's a ripe area. Another community engagement example is essentially being able to mine preprint servers for the papers that fit your journal and your goals, and then recruit those. And in fact, there are a number of journals that are doing this work manually now, and the question is, can we build tools that will help people do this in a more automated way? And I'm certain we can. This is almost not AI to do that. The third of the four areas is what we called emergence of the new. And here we're really, this is challenging. And here's why I want to highlight it as challenging. A lot of what's new in scientific fields is stuff that goes beyond the envelope of known vocabulary. That is, if you look at mesh headings, for example, in PubMed, that's a known vocabulary. And yes, we could probably build some pretty nice tools that look at mesh terms and see whether some of them are essentially trending, the way things trend in Twitter. But I think here we're talking about vocabulary that exceeds the standard taxonomy, that falls outside of it. And that's really, really challenging. And it's challenging computationally. There are some examples of this going on. There is something called the League of Scholars, which is a commercial product. They have something they call WOW rankings, whole of web. Don't ask me why they call it that. But essentially, this is helping editors, publishers identify the superstars, usually the people. What our editors were interested in when we were talking to them about emergence was they were focused mostly on topics. But very quickly, topics translates to people, because those are the people you're going to go and recruit for writing review articles and joining your editorial board and so on. So I think the personal side of this, the people side of it, is every bit as important, and maybe even more important than just following topics. Another example in emergence is a tool that Meta has in-house that they call horizon scanning. And this is actually something that they've licensed from the Stanford Research Institute. And it's a very cool tool, but it's really hard to scale for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, that the vocabulary is essentially unbounded. What you have to do is process all the literature to find what the concepts are that are just, essentially pairs of words, and that are starting to blossom. I think there probably are commercial examples of concept emergence. I will bet that the various security agencies in the US and in other countries are monitoring our cell phone conversations for concept emergence. And so some of this black ops stuff really is on the horizon. HighWire is doing with Meta right now a concept emergence experiment where essentially we're working with associate editors in one of our largest journals, identifying what fields each of them work in, and then monitoring. Is that mine? Okay. Monitoring for new concepts and emerging concepts that are in their particular fields, so that we can give them some advanced intelligence about something that's in their area, but it's just taking off. And then they, as an associate editor, can decide what actions to take. Right now, we're in the stage of gathering data. In other words, we've implemented an experiment. We're running the experiment to gather the data. Then we're going to present this to the associate editors this summer and have them give us feedback on, was this useful? Is this insightful? Or is it just another distraction? And obviously, if it works, we'll go from there. The last of the four areas is workflow efficiency and productivity. This is where it's actually running along pretty well. A lot of tools are starting to emerge here, although they're often point solutions rather than whole workflow solutions. But this is where we're able to start to shift effort that requires real field intelligence. That is the kind of stuff that grad students, postdocs, and researchers have to do some fairly mechanical tasks that can be routinized, and AIs can be trained on it. So checklist validation, screening articles, identifying whether articles really should just be rejected as being out of scope, identifying reviewers, image integrity analysis, and so on. Okay, I think that'll work. We have examples of this. Meta has a tool they call bibliometric intelligence that operates in this area. It essentially allows you to feed a submitted article to their AI, which will then give you information about its prediction for impact, recommended reviewers, and other things that could also be quite interesting. For example, if you're a publisher that has 50 journals, let's say, and they're all in different, they're all in a single field, but related, but not the kind of thing where any one of your editors understands the scope of all of your other journals. An article comes in, let's say this is the American Chemical Society. An article comes in, is submitted to JACS, the sort of flagship journal. It's going to be rejected. Where do you cascade it to? Well, that's the kind of thing that an AI tool can help with and say, here are the top 5 journals that should evaluate this paper. Another example is statistical reviews. So there's a tool called Stat Reviewer. I've seen it mostly applied in social sciences so far, but I understand there's some people who are starting to work on applying it in the really STM classification. Sorry, this is really faded, but we covered a little bit about classification previously. Unsilo has a nice tool to develop, what you call them, micro collections?
Yeah.
Micro collections?
Yeah.
Okay.
Microsites.
Essentially being able to process your content database against a new vocabulary. And I think what Unsilo, lots of companies have done this kind of work, but what Unsilo has done is put a UI on it that's actually usable by subject matter experts, not technical experts. And I think that is a great leap forward. So thank you.
Thanks, John. That was great. Yeah, and the Unsilo stuff is particularly interesting to me, particularly around the micro sites and micro collection stuff. I mean, it's one of the things that we're interested in Emerald because we have this idea about real impact and aligning ourselves to sustainability goals and things of that nature. And it's a way to kind of, you could imagine like a climate science pop-up site or a
new topic comes
yeah,
up.
yeah.
And you want to see what you have in that area.
Yeah.
You can't use whatever old vocabulary you have.
Yeah.
But something can identify the patterns.
Yes. Yeah.
We probably could have used these kinds of tools with SARS, for example.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
We've been called that before.
Yeah. So taxonomies, in a sense, or traditional taxonomies, are lag indicators of what the scholarly landscape actually looks like. So we have some time for questions. We've got one microphone, which we'll have to kind of bounce backwards and forwards. Oh, we've got a radio mic as well. So I'll have to use this in the audience. So I have one or two questions, but I think it's probably a good idea to see if we have some questions from the audience first. Does anybody have any thoughts, any hands going up before I resort to moderators' questions? Sorry? So questions can be about anything that you've heard, or it can be...
Anthony's saying, isn't John going to speak?
I will speak.
He will speak,
I can speak,
but he will be speaking after the break, yes.
Okay.
All right, so we have a question right here. I'm going to be the microphone person as well as the moderator.
So I'm just curious if there's been any experiments with social science content. This has been largely focused on hard sciences. And is that ontology problem particular to social science? Oh, sorry. Is the ontology problem that we're talking about, the names for things, is that a particular challenge to social science, and that's why we really haven't seen many experiments in those fields?
So I only have a little bit of a commentary on that. It's a good question. The one example that I did show from Stat Reviewer, my understanding is that is it was originally built to work in social science, but that's not a vocabulary tool in particular. It's looking at methodologies to see if they're appropriate. So it may be that vocabulary is particularly challenging in the social sciences because my impression, not being a social scientist, is that its vocabulary is less controlled than in physical sciences and life sciences. And I think that's just more challenging. So words have multiple meanings depending on context, which of course AI can handle, but it needs a lot more training to do that reliably. You don't use individual words, you look at noun phrases, and you may have to look at context within a sentence to know that this is, I better not try and give an example, it will be foolish, but so I think it's more challenging, but it's not impossible. If Google seems to be able to rank search results in social sciences, and Google Scholar can. So my guess is this is problems that can be resolved.
Actually, Clarivate, John, do you have some thoughts about that? Sorry, we've got one John S and another John S, so I'm struggling to separate the two when I'm talking about them. So we've decided we're going to go with Clarivate John and HighWire John.
That's not the company rebrand, by the way. Just to add. Yeah, well, that will come. I think it's more a perspective of, can you actually capture the content in the first place? So if you look through the lens of Garfield, as introduced by Phil, and I think you were referencing impact factor, and that was used to help look at large content sets. So as journals are coming in, can we put an indicator on them in order to understand and to pass off for, for editorial decisions. And, that was from a content perspective, i.e., can we acquire new content? In the field of social sciences, from Clarate's perspective, we have a lot of social science content. If you put it through the lens of, kind of impact factor, citation metrics, generally, these indicators which aren't, kind of AI as Phil described it, they're not as robust. But that's not to say that we can't mine social science content to find, kind of trends. And in particular, if you look at, emerging areas of research, I think you can start applying, AI techniques, cluster modeling, for example, to uncover, what is actually being produced and written in social science. But with all data sets, in particular AI, the larger the data set, the better. So it's always a question on, how much data can you have, and then, subsequent to that, can you then apply these techniques to that in order to actually understand and classify it?
I think the comment about the larger data sets being important is worth repeating. I think all three of us would comment on that. It's one of the reasons that HighWire has decided to partner on AI with Meta and with Google, because they have very large data sets. When I look at the areas that our publishers wanted us to work in, none of them wanted to work only within their own journal context. As I said, market share was a big topic for journal performance. Well, that's not something that is resolved within the context of a single journal. So you had to have a large data set, PubMed scale, Clarivate scale, and so on.
This is ridiculous, isn't it? I would add to that, doing some reading on various machine learning textbooks and things like that, and there are various numbers around, like you may need around even 5,000 labeled examples for a category to start getting good results, and you only start getting really, really sometimes meaningful or human level results, sometimes with data sets of over 10 million and things like that. So maybe that also applies to social sciences, like if you've got words being used in different contexts, depending on which deep learning technique you need, you'll need very different types of data sets, but they can be huge, and that's a very limiting factor.
So I have a question. So we've talked a lot about the possibilities of AI, and one of the things that happens, you've mentioned this before, John, when new technologies emerge, is that we all kind of try and find ways of using them, and we get very excited about them. Can you talk a little bit about the potential risks, perhaps, about getting overexcited in too short a term about these technologies? Is there any kind of indicators of which areas of innovation are going to stick, and which areas of innovation are going to be kind of a flash in the pan, what's going to fall down the chasm, those sorts of issues? Because I think a lot of people are going to be looking at these and thinking, well, there's lots of different possibilities. What's really going to be, the thing that's going to be actually useful and is really going to move the needle for us?
So I think one of the things that I think was really important in Isabel's talk is don't invest in AI yourself, and especially living as I do in Silicon Valley, it's really intriguing to look at this and think, yes, why don't we hire an AI person? But first of all, it's really expensive to do that. Second, if you tried to hire them in Silicon Valley, you'd be competing with all sorts of startups that have hundreds of millions of dollars, as well as Google and others. So I think it's really important to look at where AI is and how fast it's moving. But not to fall into the trap of expecting it to produce results right away. Gartner has a picture, they call it the hype cycle, and AI is in the Gartner hype cycle, AI is just past the peak of inflated expectations. Can you find it?
I'm not sure as I have it. Keep talking. I'll see if I can find it.
Which is interesting because it suggests that you really, if you're going to go down this path, you have to be prepared for some disappointment, for some rework, and so on. It's not just going to be another production. Yeah, so there's the picture. And AI is, can you point to, it's machine learning. It's just past the peak.
Just past the peak, we're sitting here.
Yeah. So what's interesting is Gartner predicts that it's 3 to 5 years out from really being productive, which means at that point it's sort of production ready. Everybody will know how to use it and have straightforward implementations. So they've focused primarily on machine learning as the technology that is advancing most quickly. I think that's probably true. For example, we probably are not going to invest in machine vision the way Waymo is with autonomous vehicles. But a lot of our work being text-based will probably work well for machine vision. Just one other comment. The thing that I think is really important when something is at this point in the hype cycle is that you always have an idea about how you're going to validate the results. And that you treat it as a scientific project. In other words, imagine that you were going to publish an article in one of your own journals about some AI innovation. You'd have to show the data. You'd have to prove that it's at least as good, if not better, than the best available alternatives. So I'd say we must consider validation as part of all these projects.
Oh my God, there's so many things I could pick up there. One thing I was going to say about hiring the right type of people, which again is obviously a kind of strategic problem. What I think is hilarious is that now startups that are being bought, you can often charge what's in the range of £5 to £10 million per AI expert is the kind of, if you were trying, companies investing in mergers and acquisitions are in the AI area at the moment. And if you do get those types of people in, if you decide, look, I'm going to put aside 150 grand for like a bloody good one, and actually that's not even that good, they're probably not going to stay. Like in your organisation, they're not going to want to hang out in this environment. If they're the sort of people at the cutting edge, they are going to want to be pushed in an environment that's a little bit different from some of the. You can't just silo them in one little area and be like, can you do your AI over there? It's never going to work. But that means what I think we should be doing is training people up to work with AI, because it's not just about the programming and the development of the techniques. A big part of it is you have a huge number of roles for translators and people that can understand how it works. Someone else, maybe the vendor, does the development, but you have to have people in the business, who know how to use it, how to interpret it, and also you have the really deep domains. And we can definitely work on developing the people with really deep domain expertise. So you sort of, and I think all of this actually maps to what are called Wardley maps, which I don't know if you've heard of, where you can sort of plot utility to the user on one spectrum, and on the other one, on one axis, and the other one is commoditization. And we should all be focusing our attention on the areas where we can truly add value and that we have the expertise to act and develop the best products. We should be focusing on those types of areas. And like I mentioned briefly, no one here really wants to be developing their brand new machine learning techniques. Like, that's not our area of expertise. You leave that to someone else, and then you probably the best use for communication is to take advantage of commoditized things as they become more available, which is why it is in the realm of achievability now that we can start to see actual use cases. Just going to say, though, you asked about emerging technologies, and I think obviously one of the biggest ones, and I don't know if we'll talk about this or later, is maybe trust and explainable AI and the black box kind of problem, because I think this is going to be one that we see a huge amount of development in over the next few years, and that will tie in with validation and how we want to, what kind of validation we want to, how much we want any example to prove that it can do what it says it's going to do. And I saw just the other day there's a really project with UC Berkeley and University of Amsterdam, Facebook and people. They've developed an artificial intelligence system that can point to why it made. It's the first one that can point to why it made a decision and explain why it did it. So, for example, it has like the little pictures of someone surfing, whatever, and then it's got heat maps for the parts of the picture that it used to make the decision, and then it says, I think they're surfing. It's surfing because it is in water and there are rough waves or something like that, and it explains what it does in quite simple language. And so this is an area I think that we're going to see a lot of kind of very interesting development.
So we're nearly out of time before the break, but we have time for just one more quick question. And Joanne's been
patient.
Across the road patiently.
So I had a question about training. So we're talking a fair amount about how you can't have the AI person off in a corner. And for most publishers, our workforce is pretty distributed. If you're focusing on the editor as having some of the highest impact, this is maybe 5 to 10% of their day. They're in any far-flung country, anywhere in the world. And rolling out even the greatest tool can have limited adoption. So how are you thinking about the rollout of some of these tools and getting folks engaged so that we can really experience the impact?
That's a good question.
It's a good question. Do you have any good answers?
I can try, but...
Yeah, I can try too.
I think it's, if you put it in the context of, kind of AI at the point of adoption, so, just personal anecdote, I took a Lyft, which is, kind of an Uber equivalent, which is using... But better, okay. But the point was the guy's using a Google map, to, tell or to predict which route he should take to get, to the hotel. He overrides the suggestion because there's 3 different levels you can actually drive through Chicago to get here. Yes. He was wrong, and then he went back to, the Google map. But my point here is that, he's using AI without even thinking about it as in a tool, to aid him in his or her decision. And I think in terms of, kind of rolling out products, to editors, for example, I may not necessarily know what that particular product is right now. People are working on things, as John shared in his presentation. But I think the point is it's got to be simple enough just to use almost without thinking and intuitively. And I think if we can do that, then it will be successful. If we don't, we'll have the many examples of where AI is just gone down a dead end and not really delivered what it could potentially do so.
So it's kind of not product-oriented, it's about making it about a solution-oriented thing rather than a technology-oriented thing. So in a sense, we've organised this seminar about AI, and the take-home is let's stop talking about AI.
I think that's right where Isabel started.
Where Isabel started off, yeah.
So that's a really good question. It's been a challenging one to grapple with. The 2 thoughts somewhat opposing. I think what we're going to be seeing in the short term is more of what I call point solutions, things that are quite narrowly focused at very specific problems, like find me the right reviewers for this paper. Things that are really narrow, because the more comprehensive stuff is going to be much harder to validate and roll out. The second thought is, in order to get it rolled out, you have to put it in the workflow. It can't be something you're asking somebody to do also. And that is also challenging because making changes in the way editors work, everybody in the room probably knows you don't get it harder than that. Changing authors is harder. So to come up with something that will work in the workflow smoothly, it has to be a solution to a problem they have as opposed to a problem they didn't know they had. So that's a challenging topic.
Yeah, just quickly.
Just very quickly, I think exactly it's all about use cases, and I think actually maybe using this sort of AI tool will start making people ask all kinds of questions about it that they don't really need to and that aren't important. I organised the AI session plenary at Alps, and one of the guys there from EchoBox was talking about how his tool was being used in newsrooms, and he said that people were actually thrilled when their tool came in because suddenly they were able to do all kinds of stuff that they couldn't do before. It was incredibly useful, it was great, but I don't think they went in and was like, this AI thing is going to change your life. So I imagine we all need to become like salespeople within the organisation and think about use cases and communication and sell what the tool can do within our organisation to get all the necessary buy-in. And I know you're doing that type of thing at Emerald, so
yeah, selling talking about the business cases and the use cases, selling the problem that it solves or selling the solution. And it's true whether you're talking about AI or whether you're talking about data generally or whether you're talking about blockchain, which keeps getting asked about a lot. And all these things, it's a mistake, isn't it, to just talk about what the technology is and what it does and how we can get power out of it. We need to be breaking it down into the actual problems that people have. So that is an excellent conclusion to the first half of the seminar, and we've kind of come full circle because, as John pointed out, that's the starting point that Isabel, brought us to this, is that we don't have an AI problem, we have a strategy problem. So we're going to take a quick networking break for 20 minutes.